All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start chapter 6. So there was some issues with chapter 6, similarly to issues with chapter 5, and how the material was presented, because the majority of the stats surrounding policing, surrounding the justice system, um, were stats from within the justice system, as opposed to those maybe critiquing or having conversations about the ways in which it does not benefit or help specific groups. So just a reminder, we're going to be talking about that a lot. It also lacks a really good conversation about policing. If for some reason I cannot find, well, the 13th documentary does get into it really well, and that is something that I really want you to watch. However, if for some reason that does not, if you want more information or more resources on this, I have a multitude of resources on this, and I will be recording lectures for a different class on this particular topic coming up very soon, that has a much better chapter laid out, much better about this particular topic. And I have no problem giving you guys those lectures in a couple weeks if you want those. I am hoping that this topic is brought up a different point in your book, but I highly doubt it. But policing is something that has to be part of this conversation when we're talking about current events and when we're talking about modern social problems, right? Police reform, the racial bias that is within police systems is something that we can't ignore, and nor should we. So as we move forward in chapter 6, I want that to be something that you understand I'm very aware of. I very, very much want to have these kind of conversations. And I very much want to make sure that we are talking about the topics that matter the most to all of you and to the society at large that we are talking about right now. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen and let's get started. All right, in chapter 6, so I went ahead and put this up here too, because this is another topic within crime and deviance and the judicial system that's not talked about as much, but there are a lot of hate crimes that are significantly part of American life, and those are primarily due towards race and ethnicity, with sexual orientation and religion being the other two big motivators. Disability is also in there, and gender is in there, but only at 0.7. I would also like to mention that we, when we talk about hate crimes, do not consider the majority of sexual violence as a hate crime. Because if that person is attracted to women, then the violence done to women is not a hate crime, considered a hate crime, and that's the justification for that. And that's something that we need to kind of think about as we think about legislation and policy driven towards or surrounding violence. All right, so what is crime? Crime is a violation of a law. However, society has a lot of really dumb laws, or they have like this one, where you're not allowed to enter Wisconsin with a chicken on your head. Why that is necessary, I don't know. But at some point, somebody did something with a chicken on their head walking into Wisconsin, and somebody decided that it needed to be a law. Okay. And we have a lot of really interesting or random laws. You can look them up by state that are just incredibly entertaining. But the likelihood that those things are then going to be prosecuted or come with any kind of even social sanction, or are going to be in any way, shape, or form any kind of societal concern, it's probably not high, right? Like I would not have even known that a person carrying a chicken on their head or having a chicken on their head walking into Wisconsin would need any kind of retribution, because I didn't even know that law existed until I went for an example to have this conversation, right? And Kentucky has a whole bunch of them too. But the point here is that laws and crime are relative. They're built on whoever is making the laws, whoever's writing them up, whoever's going to pass them or not pass them, believing that either A, they'd be funny. I don't know exactly how some of these laws get passed. Or they're just checking off a box to say some legislation got done or what have you. Um, but whatever the case, it's a political process, and it's not always majority opinion, and it's super relative, right? And just because there's a law made about it does not mean it's a social problem. And just because it's a social problem does not mean there's a law related to it, right? So these things do not necessarily go hand in hand. And that's something that we do have to talk about. Crime itself is universal and it's variable because almost everything has almost every culture, almost every group of individuals has some form of um, sorry, I'm looking for some form of a rule set or a way of a social way of life that not all of them are within a legal process, but there's always rules or some kind of social limitations that they expect people within their group to follow, right? Um, and I kind of put in here some interesting things, right, when it comes to our media. So, and we've talked about those a little bit in our last chapter, but just some things related to crime that we are going to talk about, especially like um, the ways in which our police system operates and looks differently in different places. All right, so theory. Our objective conserves when it comes to crime is that, again, is those things that we can measure. So that's that crime is decreasing, but it's still very rampant. That there's a bias in the judicial system and in the policing system. That there is not, it's not representative of the majority opinion, and that policing reform and defunding the police are options that several groups or areas or local entities have considered and or tried, and those things are ongoing social, essentially social experiments that we can draw on and kind of research against to kind of compare and contrast what is working in what areas or what is not, and why not that might be. Subjective concerns are the awareness of danger when it comes to crimes, the fear of personal safety, what kind of crimes need the most resources and attention, and who is committing the crimes. And those are really the things that, when it surrounds crime, are things that people are talking about, thinking about, etc. So in symbolic interactionism, again, you're going to have a lot of labeling, modeling theory associated with this. So when you have social class and labeling, so it's that idea that they talked about with the in promising futures, or kind of the heading for trouble. So like if you fit into a specific type of social class, so a higher up, well, we don't want to ruin their promising future. So the Brock Turner incident, again, is a really good example of that, versus heading for trouble, whereas maybe a young Black male who gets pulled over with some marijuana on him or whatever. Well, obviously they're heading for trouble because there's this labeling theory that this particular person is criminal in nature and this particular person is not, depending on social class, depending on race, depending on gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there's also, they talk about the ways in which we see what people want us to see, right? Or what people want to see. And so essentially when it comes to like, say, witnesses or say any kind of judicial process, there's going to be, when once the defendant is seen, there's going to be already an image, already an idea of a person, depending on what messages you have been fed or the ways in which we have taught specific kinds of learned behavior. You're going to already have an idea. So if that person has like a neck tattoo that's showing all the way through here, there's a likelihood that the jurors are going to already make some assumptions about this particular person, whether or not that neck tattoo has anything relevant to the case, right? There's certain kind of appearance things that have been trained into us as through our media, through our news outlets, through our social programming, that essentially we need to look out for, or are things that we inherently talk about as criminal, or as things that represent criminals, that that make it so that people are going to already assume certain things of people before they even get to a case or before they even get to hear that person's words or anything. And then people's whose whole identities are criminals, right? So some people surround their entire identities around their criminality, right? So again, going back to like organized crime, right? So that particular person's going to organize their life surrounding their criminal activity, surrounding that particular group's maintaining, being part of that group, maintaining a social structure around that group. And that's going to be essentially where that's coming from, right? And it can, this particular labeling can also set people on certain paths, and that includes when educators or when people in particular institutions are labeling people a certain way, they're going to set them on certain kinds of academic paths. They're going to set them, or lack of academic paths, versus they're going to set them on specific kind of behavioral reprimanding more often, or etc. And in that, I want to talk for a brief second, something that wasn't really talked about very well and needs to be, is that school to prison pipeline, right? So this idea that certain kinds of individuals, certain kinds of students, certain kind of things are really automatically almost sent from school into these juvenile detention centers, into these prisons. And like there's this stepping stone essentially that comes with this labeling of certain kinds of kids, certain kinds of groups, specifically our young male Black and brown bodies, that are going to perpetuate kind of this idea that this is the road they're headed for anyway, so we might as well get them there early kind of situation, which really is lacking in fundamental concern about the overall well-being of that particular student. All right. And then you get into functionalism. So crime's just part of society. Again, some succeed and some don't in life. And then that strain theory again that we talked about in the last, where you're going to have essentially 5 different kinds of ideologies, where you're either going to be conforming, which is essentially that the way in which you want to access means is also a legal entity, and so it's going to shape up to match. Innovation, where you're going to come up with something that may not be legal, but you're still going to be essentially and find that success that is defined by society. Ritualization, which is essentially where that path may not be the most current one, but are the most, you're going to find success, but you're not going to necessarily find the success that is that particular societies. And even if you do, it's going to be through a process that is very cultish or concerning, or etc. Retreatism is essentially that idea that you're going to take away that particular success and create your own idea of what success is, and you're going to get there from whatever specific ways in which you're going to get there. And then rebellion being that you just don't agree with the way in which success is defined, and you don't agree in which and you're going to rebel against the idea that you need to use legal means to get there. So again, the working class tends to have far less economic and social opportunities that are legitimate, which leads them down illegitimate opportunities in order to make ends meet. Upper class and illegitimate opportunities, and we're going to get into white collar crime here in a little bit. Conflict theory. It's really just talking about how power and social class impacts essentially what kind of crime is committed, and or the way in which you're treated within the legal system. The powerful can use the law and the courts to get their way. That's not built for the majority of people. The system is consistently not built for that. That it can be bought off, that it holds up institutions of hierarchies and the hierarchies within institutions, and that it's a means of, that the criminal justice system is a means of control. All right, so the juvenile detention delinquency. So the rate per 100,000 youth in juvenile detention system. So if you look at this is our Black bodies, this is our Asian bodies, this is our Indigenous bodies, this is our Hispanic, and then you have white, and then this is the total. So this is the line essentially out of your percentage of your population you want to stay under. And whites under that, Hispanics under that, Asian American is under that. Black is significantly higher, as is Indigenous persons, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. And then here's a really good demographic about where they are, what crimes they're in for, et cetera, et cetera. And I will make that actually a little bigger for y'all, so maybe you can read the words a little better. If you want the link to all of this data, let me know. It's down here at the bottom, but if for some reason you can't get to that, or it's not giving you access, let me know. Because several of the graphics that I got were from this, because I liked the way they broke them down. So when we talk about who is a juvenile, over the course of history, who we've considered underage or a minor has been relative. When young women were having babies at 12, 14, and young boys were having making babies at such an early age, and were part of the farms and such of that nature, they weren't considered youth in the same ways, and that's kind of significantly been changing over time. Now we consider youth or a juvenile to be anyone under the age of 18. Teens make up the majority of this particular group, and the majority of who gets in any kind of criminal trouble. And it's kind of a newer category of crime, given that, again, historically things have changed. There are age-related crimes specifically to juveniles, which include drinking underage, driving underage, gambling underage, curfew violations, working laws for underage working violations, those kinds of things. And except for particularly drug use, illegal substances, juvenile crime rates are dropping, which is a good sign. So problem solving, denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemning who we're condemning for this, and having that higher loyalties are all ways in which people problem solve essentially why someone would be doing these kinds of things. And that's not necessarily the whole picture, right? There's a lot of subcultures. In some subcultures, it's a normal part of some youth's lives. It's the norms that support criminal activity. Learning to be part of criminal groups, including gangs, including just in general to survive your neighborhood, etc. And they're learning better and more efficient ways to commit crimes, especially when you talk about things like cyber crimes, any kind of technology-based criminal systems, just because of the ways in which their worlds revolve around technology, and their educations revolve around technologies in ways that previous generations just weren't. So education, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to commit crimes as youth, and that's as adults too. Education and class have a very unique through line when it comes to juvenile delinquency. Youth programs and youth centers tend to lessen youth crime in an area and lessen particularly that link between school and prison and that pipeline. The cost for education is less than that to imprison youth, so we need to really have conversations about where in which we want to put funding and why, and that could be a very big motivator. And then they're having mentors and work study programs have also been very efficient in helping to limit that particular group. All right, so I've got a couple of stats here for you. This one's pretty simple. Among individuals who have been in contact with the police or people of color disproportionately experience the use of force. So here you go. Here's this particular who had contact with the police, and these are who used force, right? So this is overarchingly our Black and brown body individuals are experiencing far more harm. Let's see here. Our U.S. Police department kills civilians at a much higher rate than police in any other wealthy country, and that's something to really have a conversation about. Again, why is that particular kind of force being used as the method for policing? And why in which is that not more of a social problem than it is? And this is again, police disproportionately threaten to use force against communities of color. So this is not just the use of force, but also the threats to use force. And we'll get in kind of the racial bias in policing. Again, I'm going to be doing a much more in-depth lecture on this particular topic here in the next couple weeks. So if you want me to add that to here, I can. I also think the 13th documentary is really good when it comes to this conversation. And I think it's done in a way that my white female bodied self is going to sound more not hypocritical. It's going to be from the point and perspective of those it impacts far more than from me, who is a white female person who is far less likely and probably in the category most least likely to have police use force against me. That is not to say that I do not care about this topic. Please do not hear me. I actively think that this is one of the more important topics we're going to cover in this class, and that's why I think the 13th documentary is so important. And I will again be doing some more in-depth lectures on this particular point. If you guys want me to get you resources and add some lectures on that, I think that that would be really good. All right, so let's get in here and get into the rest of this. So let's talk about white collar crime for a second. So white collar crime is the crime that predominantly is done by those in positions of authority, in those with certain kinds of power, with those in certain kinds of classes, right? And so there's a subculture and a demographic that generally, again, takes part in these crimes, and that's where work environments that support crime, they breed white collar crime specifically because of high pressure, these absolute needs for profits, or they'll or bust essentially. So that's going to be in your more economic based environments, things like stock markets, things like money management, things of that nature, and this desire to climb corporate ladders. So the privilege, you're going to have very much, these people are very rarely arrested or convicted. They manipulate the legal system quite well. They have the best lawyers. They have the best ability to buy off this judicial system. And it's mostly men, but as women start being part of these more corporate positions and these higher up positions, there has been an increase in their white collar crime as well. So there is white collar crimes that do kill people. Most white collar crimes are considered money related or embezzlement or in some kind of employment theft, things of that nature that generally we think of as hurting the company more or what have you. Now that's not to say that these cases don't have impacts on individuals, because they do. Because if your banking institution gets hit or something like that and it drains your account, that's going to have a large impact on you, whether or not you are wealthy or not. However, there's a lot more insurance and things that are going to take care of those particular problems and get that money back to you than there are in some of these particular crimes that we're going to talk about. So there are corporations that ignore serious issues when it comes to products. I think they were talking about a similar line in GM particularly, and some of the cars that have been made with particular safety issues over the course of history, and how those issues impacted the lives of other people. You also have things like poisoning natural resources, waterways, toxic dumps, things of that nature, where you're going to have an understanding that these things are going to impact the people around, or the people who have well water, or the people who may be using a particular environment for some kind of I'm thinking maybe like indigenous people who have particular sacred grounds who then tend to be have toxic waste dumps or things of that nature. And then if you use those grounds over long periods of time, you're going to end up with far more health concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And doing that, these companies knows those health concerns and continue to do these things anyway because they can pay the fines, they can pay the EPA violations, they can do et cetera, et cetera. There's also dangerous labor laws for those who work in other countries and somewhat in ours too, that leave particular groups, say particular kinds of farming, particular kinds of manufacturing, particular kinds of any kind of labor law where you're working really extensive hours with limited breaks, not getting sleep times, not getting food times, things of that nature can be very dangerous. And those companies can break those particular laws in a number of cases. And then again, the use of prison labor in particularly troubling ways. Think of, in some ways, we can talk about how prison labor is used as part of sweatshops, or we can talk about in use in mining and other points in our history, and in other countries it still happens, or the use of prison labor to build the railroad, or the use of the prison labor to fight fires and wildfires, things of that nature. All right. Let's get in here. Professional crime. So again, these are people who consider crime their occupation. So you're thinking like organized crime. You're thinking those who deal with things like chop shops, things like gangs, things like running out of there's other things. My examples are less than great right now. But crime, they think of their crime as work. They think of it as a skill. It's something that they're doing, and they think of it as a way of making it, right? A way of making it in a world with limited opportunities. So organized crime are criminals who are part of larger networks, perhaps even national or international in scope. So the mafia is the one that generally pops up in our brain when we think of organized crime, and that originated in Sicily. But now organized crime is made up in the United States of Sicilians, Italians, African Americans, Chinese, Colombians, Cubans, Irish, Japanese, Puerto Ricans, and Russians. And note that no one of these groups are dramatically more overtaking than the other. Now there are areas in the US that are different for different groups and are more prominent than some of the other groups. But all of these groups resonate somewhere and have a pretty good foothold somewhere. However, it is far less than at other previous points in the US history. So they talk about this kind of our thing structure, or this idea that essentially we're going to do and live amongst our code, amongst our ideologies, amongst what it is we do, without kind of this shame or feeling like they're doing something that's inherently wrong, because they have this code that they live by, right? They have this ideologies that they live by that promote a different version of societal norms, right? And so why are they successful? Usually successful organized crime is that way because it's very organized. It has a lot of bureaucracy in it, right? So there's a hierarchy, there's a rank, there's a system in place. They usually serve high demand services. So think embezzlement, think money laundering, think murder for hire, think drug dealing, think transportation of services to and from countries, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of political corruption in the way of these. So they have gotten their way into political processes, gotten their way into lobbying, into at a local level, or maybe even upwards depending. Um, and that also includes political corruption within their policing departments. They also have very good control mechanisms for violence to victims and to members to discourage talking, to discourage disclosing the way in which that particular system works. And then the way in which this was weakened in the United States was this: they kind of went to war with the government in certain capacities, and that created a lot of need for kind of internal workings or get people inside the organizations. So a lot of FBI went undercover, and that created and broke down a lot of a lot of the families in bigger organizations. There's also a lot of famous characters that got a lot of notoriety, but with a lot of notoriety came a lot of attention and a lot of essentially surveillance. And then these are decreasing, but again, they're not gone. So especially when it comes to moving drugs in this country, we still have a lot of organized crime that's related to that. Human trafficking has a lot of organized crime associated with it, and things of that nature. All right, so we're going to stop there, and then we'll come back in and we'll talk about the criminal justice system for a bit, and then get into some of our other topics. All right, so again, take care of yourself, and we're getting through this.